Maker's Corner aboard the Villa Vie Odyssey, hosted by Kit Cassingham.
Good evening.
Good evening.
It's good to see you all again. I'm really looking forward to this. I have several friends who are archaeologists, but to have one on board who will talk to us about his passion is pretty cool. Dr. Robert Schick is an archaeologist and historian with a career focused on the late Roman through modern periods in Jordan and Israel, Palestine. He's been excavating in the region since 1974, and the University of Chicago gave him his PhD in 1987. That thesis is the topic of tonight's talk. Look for his book that he's finishing an update on the same topic. How soon will that be coming out?
Well, I finish it.
As soon as he finishes it, it'll be out.
Momentarily.
So look for it. A few more C days and he'll be with it. So let's welcome Robert Schick.
Okay, so thanks for coming, and I do wish to speak this evening on my favorite topic. It's the topic that I've devoted the bulk of my academic career to, and that's sort of the later periods in Jordan, modern day Israel, with a focus on the religious makeup of the population and how they change from being pagans in the Roman period to being Christians in the later Roman centuries, and then they all become Muslims after the Muslim conquests of the early 7th century. So that study of multiple phases of changes in the religious affiliation of the region is what I spent more time than any other topic in the course of my career. Now I'm going to speak about the area of modern day Jordan, Israel, where I've focused my attention. In late Roman times, this was the provinces of Palestine and Arabia. And so I'm including modern day Jordan, modern day Israel, and then the Sinai Peninsula, which was a part of the Roman province of Palestine at the time. Now in that region, there are about 1,000 archaeological ruins of early Christian churches. A lot of them have been excavated, not all of them yet. And the question that I'm especially interested in, and where I've spent the bulk of my time excavating, are these ruins of early Christian churches, with the objective of determining, if I can, when do those churches go out of use? Of those 1,000, only 2 have stayed in continuous use since antiquity. That's the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem and the church in St. Catherine's Monastery at Mount Sinai. All the other churches have had some phase of destruction, maybe rebuilding, but they've gone out of use at some point, well, in the distant past. And so I have set myself the goal of, as best I can, to determine how and when, why all of those 1,000 archaeological ruins became ruins, as a way of understanding what's happening to the people worshiping in those church buildings. Are the churches destroyed by an earthquake? Are they abandoned? Do people move in, make use of the former church building for some other purpose? Whatever. There's a variety of things that happened to these church buildings, and I'll present a few examples of places where I personally have worked to show the variety of things that have happened to these church buildings in antiquity, and to demonstrate what are the questions I'm asking as I'm excavating these buildings to figure out what happens to them. Now, I'm covering in tonight's presentation the early Islamic period up until the Crusades. We have the Muslim conquest of Greater Syria in the years from 634 to 640. The Prophet Muhammad dying in 632, and then after his death is the main phase of the Islamic conquest of Greater Syria and then elsewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean. And then we have a sequence of ruling dynasties, the Umayyads, and then the Abbasids, Fatimids, Seljuks, until the Crusaders arrived. Now, I'm not going to focus really on the historical events. That's going to be too much for one talk, and it's not critically important to my question of what is happening to the Christians worshiping in their churches during the period. But the ultimate question I would like to understand better than I do is the question, what is the situation when the Crusaders arrive in 1099? Is the population still mostly Christian, or have Muslims become the majority of the population? It's still an open question. I think it's sort of half and half, but being better than just hopelessly vague with what the proportion is what I've said for one of the questions I want to understand better. Okay, well, I've mentioned one of the churches that has stayed in continuous use without ever being destroyed is the monastery of St. Catherine at Mount Sinai, and that's the 6th century church which still survives. Mount Sinai is too isolated for anybody to care about it, so nobody has ever been motivated enough to get there and sack it or whatever. So it's been continually in use since it was built in its current form in the 6th century AD by the Emperor Justinian. Okay, this is a photograph of the eastern end of the church with the altar in the center there, and you can see that churches are filled with stuff. There's the altar there's a table, there are these little columns supporting a little roof over the altar. There are these marble panels, marble posts, pavement. In an area on the east end of the church, you go up a couple of steps to get up to this area with these marble panels separating the area of the altar from where the congregation is. And there's oil lamps, incense burners, various liturgical vessels, so a lot of things that were there that every church would have had. And the question is, when I'm excavating a church, do I find any of this stuff? Typically not, because the churches have been robbed out, and you don't find typically any of this stuff because at some point somebody's come along and removed them from the church. And so the main question I will ask, what of these furnishings did we find? Now, marble, every church is going to have marble panels and posts. Now, marble has a recycle value. So that's the first thing that gets removed. If anything is going to get removed, it'll be the marble panels, either for reuse as panels in some later building or for making plaster. Now, the process for making plaster is you heat up limestone as the first step to make lime, and then you get, that's part of the process for making plaster. So marble is a convenient source of material to make lime, and you might have a lime kiln built in the remains of the church for on-the-spot processing. So you typically don't find much of the marble. That's the first thing to get removed after they've taken off the valuable incense burners and whatever. Now, you're going to have, in this church, you have a pavement. You might have mosaic floors in other churches. In the church at Mount Sinai, you've got this lovely mosaic on the wall in the semi-dome in the eastern end of the apse. This is about the only place in the region where the mosaic remains intact. Wall mosaics are going to be the first thing to fall off when the walls collapse or the ceiling collapses. So this is the only place that has one preserved in my region. There are some other churches that you have evidence that there once was wall mosaics, but that is invariably destroyed as the building collapses. You also have here the roof. These are the original roof beams from the 6th century, still intact in the church at the monastery of St. Catherine at Mount Sinai. And the important thing about wood is that it burns. And in a lot of churches, the roof burns down. That's what happens with the question of when and how churches go out of use. They burn down at some point. So if we find ash layers, well, okay, that means the roof has burned down at some point. Now, wood also has a recycle value, so there might be cases where the later people will come and remove the beams because wood is expensive and not so easy to find in the desert areas of which much of this country is. So either you find ash or nothing, or the wood is decayed over the years after these church buildings go out of use. Well, so here we have the site of Hamama in southern Jordan, in the desert area of the Wadi Rum area, where you see how bleak it is, and there are no trees, so they've got to bring in the wood from some faraway place. And here it's just completely barren, with a church building there that I will talk about in the middle of this small village with a population of just a few hundred people, with the village remains all along here. And churches have a standardized plan. Most every church is identical, with an apse or maybe 3 apses on the east end, the raised platform where the altar was, where the pulpit was, where these marble panels would have been placed along there, and then a central aisle and 2 side aisles, perhaps other rooms on the sides. This room was the storage room for the liturgical vessels, the sacristy building. And so this is where I spent my time in the early 1990s working on the excavation of this site here. And this is the view, again, of this eastern area. And one thing you don't see is any evidence of the altar. It's gone. You don't see any evidence for the pulpit, which would have been there. It's gone. Somebody has come in and taken the altar and the pulpit away. These are built of marble, so at some point they've been removed. And then you have a flagstone pavement, no mosaics in this particular church, but you've got wall preservation of 2 to 3 meters, and that's the way it was when we came along and started excavating here. That's what we found, and it's not what was there originally, because, well, you've got this layer of deposit, about 2 meters total height there, and what do you see? Ash. This is unambiguous evidence that the church burned down. The roof burned down. That's what this thick ash deposit is. And then you've also got some tumble blocks on either side here from the walls falling in after the roof had collapsed and the wood beams had burned. And then you've got a lot of just windblown sand over the centuries after the fire that destroyed the church building, with no evidence of anybody using that building in some way after the fire. Now, below the ash deposit from the burned roof beams, we do have about 30 centimeters of deposit. We've got a very, very thin line of yellow soil, right, that's directly on top of the flagstone pavement. And then you've got, well, a few pieces of marble. This is a piece of marble. That is as well. That's as well. So we found a few random scattered pieces of the marble panels that would have once been there. But we did not find anything close to all of the pieces. Just a few random pieces randomly strewn about in the eastern part of the church. And so this initial yellow clay layer, I think, is the start of the disintegration of the roof before the large-scale collapse of the roof and the beams burning down. Now the question is, when does all of this happen? How long does it take? When do people stop using the church? And what's the time gap between the people coming in, removing the marble panels, removing the altar, removing the pulpit, and strewing out a few random pieces of marble? How long is it between the abandonment of the church and the roof burning down? That's a difficult question. I'm thinking that there's a significant amount of time when the building stays as an intact structure, but it's sort of difficult to give a precise time range. Well, here's another photograph. Here's the post holes for the pulpit. There would have originally been, sort of 2-meter high pole columns supporting a raised platform where the priest stands, and they're not there. We found no trace of them, which means they were taken away before we have the ash here. This is again the roof beams burning down. We've got a few random pieces of marble here, but nothing close to the total amount of marble that would have been there for the pulpit using these post holes. And this is the one panel that we found the most pieces of, about half of it, and just random few pieces of all of the other dozen or more marble panels that were removed before the building burned down. Now in this case, it's very interesting. This piece, you see, has been discolored by heat from the fire that burns the roof down. This piece was somehow exposed to the heat of the fire, but the adjacent pieces were not. So these pieces were sort of strewn about in the church, and one got exposed to the heat from the burning roof beams, the others didn't. Now this destruction, I'm sort of inclined to date to the early 8th century, but don't want to be so insistent on a close date, but that the abandonment, the removal of the marble is taking place in the early 8th century. This is about 100 years after the Muslim conquest that this church is going out of use. And when the fire happens, well, I don't know, but I think the church goes out of use in the early 8th century. Now to go back again, I want to speak about this room here, the sacristy room where the liturgical vessels are stored, the priest's garments, and this is the more than 2 meter depth of deposit. And what do we see here? Ash. Aha! The roof is burning down, except it's not. This is cooking ash, because in the post-church period, people come along and install a bread oven. They lift up paving stones and insert a bread oven. So people are baking bread and tossing the ash out onto the floor of that sacristy room. It's not compatible with a church use, but the building is still structurally intact, so people find it a convenient place to bake bread. Again, I think in the early 8th century. So this ash is not the roof burning down, but it's cooking ash. Okay, so in this case, I think it's pretty clear that we've got a abandoned church building that stays structurally intact for some time after the church ceases to be a church. People come in, they remove as much of the furnishing as they want to. People cook bread in one of the rooms, and then eventually the building burns down. Okay, well, also at that site there's another church building that's only recognizable because it has this curved apse. That's, you can tell even before you excavate that this had once been a church, but the plan is so filled with rooms and walls that you don't clearly see the church plan. In this case, again, it's in the early 8th century, about 100 years or less after the Muslim conquest. People move into the former church building and build rooms of a house. So we've got people living inside the remains of the church. It's not a church use when you've got people building their various walls for rooms, and they're living as in a domestic house. Okay, so that's another fate that happens. This also, well, it doesn't look like a church to me, but it was. When they continued excavating, it took them 4 seasons to finally figure out that this was a church building. Again, when they found the apse here, which was a substantial, well-built part of the building that the locals decided not to dismantle. They simply incorporated it again, once again, into the rooms of a house. So at this site of Hamaima, we've got, of the three churches I'm mentioning, one is abandoned, the marble removed, and it burns down. The other two, the church is so completely rebuilt as houses that you don't immediately recognize that it had once been a house. And none of the marble, none of the other furnishings were found. They had completely cleared out all of the church features before they built houses there. Okay, now, what's interesting with that date of the early 8th century for this end of the Christians at this site is the historical claim to fame of this site in this desert area of southern Jordan, where the Abbasid family, these are the people who become the dynasty of the Abbasids after the Abbasid Revolution of 750. For reasons which I'm not going to go into, they chose to move into this remote desert site around the year 705 up until the time of the Abbasid Revolution, when they go off to Iraq and become the caliphs of the Abbasid Caliphate. Now the Abbasids are the descendants of Abbas, the uncle of the Prophet Muhammad. So they are an aristocratic family who choose this place to live around 705, and so we have the grandchildren of Abbas, the uncle of the Prophet Muhammad, lives in this palace at the site. That's a few hundred meters away from those churches I just showed. And so it's the grandchildren, and then the great-grandchildren, and the great-great-grandchildren of Abbas, the uncle of the Prophet Muhammad, who live here, including the first two Abbasid caliphs, were born at this site. So that's a curious choice of the family to choose to live here. And it's clear that when this Abbasid aristocratic family shows up, the Christians are no longer there. Perhaps they've left even before the Abbasid family lives there, but certainly no later than the arrival of the Abbasids are there Christians at this site any further. And this is happening about the year 700 or so. So it's within 100 years, Christians come to an end at this site. And so then the Abbasids, being an aristocratic Muslim family, build a mosque, and this is the Abbasid family mosque right next to their palatial residence, which is there. And so then the Abbasids don't take over any of the churches to convert into a mosque. That doesn't happen very often. The Muslims everywhere mostly choose to build new buildings, not converting churches into mosques. It happens, but only rarely. And in this case, as an example, the Abbasids don't turn a church building into a mosque. They build their own new mosque buildings. So this is one case where I was working where you had clear evidence of when, and you can understand why, because of the historical accounts of the Abbasid family living there, and that makes it impossible for Christians to continue at that particular small site. Well, this is another site in northern Jordan called Jebel, where there's extensive ruins of a major town from Roman to later Roman into Umayyad, early Islamic times. And This is one church where I was working in the 1980s, and you have then a typical church, the apse with the curved apse, and then the three aisles, and other rooms off to one side. Well, anyway, what's important here is that in the early Islamic period, again, sort of late 7th, 8th century, this church goes out of use, and the use to which the building was put is of some interest. We have, more or less in the 8th century, a wall, and I'll show you a picture in a moment, a wall is built blocking that apse. It can no longer be a church after the wall blocks access to the apse where the altar and the pulpit will be. So this is the wall that's blocking access to the apse. And at that point it can no longer be a church. But the building is still standing. It's still an intact building. And the people, residents, use that abandoned church building for some other purpose. Yes?
Why are you not speaking of the Jews that were prior to that were actually important in creating that?
There aren't, certainly in Jordan, there are no Jews attested after the Muslim conquest. In what is modern day Israel, there's a remnant Jewish population in eastern Galilee and the Golan Heights, and only precious few anywhere else. Perhaps in what is modern day Israel, at the time of the Muslim conquest, about 10% of the population was this remnant Jewish population. And I personally have not been involved in any excavation project of the few dozen synagogues that date to the late Roman period. And I'm choosing to speak about buildings where I personally have worked. Now, okay, so there's the 10% Jewish population in eastern Galilee. In Golan Heights, there's a tiny Samaritan remnant population. They've mostly been killed off because they launch unsuccessful rebellions against the late Roman government. They get exterminated, so that there are no Samaritans anymore. And so they really Jews, there are no Jews in modern day Jordan after the time of the Muslim conquest. There's simply no physical attestation of them. So I'm speaking about the 90% plus of the population who are Christians and how they then become or not become Muslims. And my work, well, the question of what happens to all those dozen or so Jewish synagogues is a question that would benefit from someone addressing the topic that I'm dealing for, but it's not been done yet. Okay, so here we've got the wall blocking off the apse and a plaster floor. Now we've got an interesting sequence of events. You've got the plaster floor, then a bedding layer with mosaic cubes. The impressions of the mosaic cubes in the plaster bedding. And then this cobbly soil here, which is where the marble panels of the chancel screen had been placed. They're removed, and you've got this cobbly layer to level off the floor. But then you've got this mortar bedding layer with the impressions of mosaic cubes in it, which means that there once had been a mosaic floor here that is totally removed. There are no loose cubes around, but somebody came in, decided to totally remove the mosaic floor, and then put in a plaster floor. Why? If you don't want to have the mosaic floor there, why not just put a plaster floor on top of the mosaic? Why take the effort to remove carefully every single mosaic floor, every mosaic cube in that floor? What's the point? Well, it seems to me there is a market for recycled mosaic cubes. Somebody somewhere else wants to lay a new mosaic floor. There are plenty of buildings that Muslims are living in the area. So seemingly they're taking the effort and time to carefully remove that mosaic floor because there's a recycle demand for the cubes. Okay, so we've got the marble furnishings are removed, the mosaic floor is removed, and a plaster floor is put in its place. Okay, so the plaster floor is kept extremely clean. There's no trace of any sort of occupational deposit. It's were you signaling? Oh, I thought you were fine. Okay. Yes, that there's no evidence that people lived here because there's no occupational debris. The plaster floor, which replaces the mosaic floor, is totally clean. People are sweeping it clean. Why? What is this building being used for? It's not being used as a church. It's not being used for housing because there's no interior walls dividing up the space. There's no occupational debris. So what is the building being used for? Well, one idea that might come to mind is that it's in some sort of public use. And what would that public use be if not a mosque? So this is one exception where there is a possibility that this church was turned into a mosque. The problem is, if this was a mosque, there would be a mihrab niche. This sort of curved niche in mosques that point the direction to Mecca. Without that architectural feature, you cannot be certain that this building is being used as a mosque. Early on in the early Islamic period, every mosque building will have that curved niche. That's the identifying feature of a building as a mosque, if it has that mihrab, the curved niche. Well, this is the south wall where, before we excavated, there's simply no trace of a niche there. And so it remains uncertain. Without that mihrab niche blatantly there, you can't confirm that it was a mosque that is the conversion of the church into a mosque. So you've got that as a possibility, but irritatingly, just not. My microphone just went off. Okay, yes. So this is, you'd like to be able to say yes or no, but you can't in this place. Now another site, again where I worked in the 1980s, is this pilgrimage site where the early Christians located the place where Lot and his daughters lived after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah on the edge of the Dead Sea. So this is a major Christian pilgrimage site. Now this building here, that's the cave where Lot and his daughters lived right there. So there's this big basilica, water reservoir, the Pilgrim's Hospice, and some other rooms. There's the bread oven is there for the community who's living there, and we have continued use of this pilgrimage site into the early Islamic period. And there was a sequence of mosaic floors. Here's one, and the last of the mosaic floors here, indicating stages of continued use of the building. And so you have still using Greek, into the 7th century, ending, well, Greek eventually gets replaced by Arabic. For the first generations after the conquest, they're still having inscriptions in Greek. Now, Lot and his daughters are part of the Christian tradition, based on, the book of Genesis that tells the story. Sorry. And Lot is also a figure mentioned in the Quran. And we have this pot found in the excavation where we've got this Arabic molding on this fancy pot. Okay. Okay, so then, which has wording reminiscent of a verse in the Quran. So if this is a pot made by a Muslim, and what is that pot doing at this Christian pilgrimage site, which does have also an Islamic interest? Well, that's really the only evidence for there being any Muslims coming to this pilgrimage site. So anyway, that pilgrimage site goes into the 8th, seemingly into the 9th century, at which point it goes out of use, not continuing beyond the 9th century. Well, then another site, and this will be the last one I'll talk about, we have in the agricultural fields at the south end of the Dead Sea, there's this remnant of the late Roman Islamic period city of War Safi, where I was excavating in the 2010s. And we have then, it's a very, very large building, only a portion of which we have in fact been able to excavate. And we've got again a case where there is an intact building, and when the church goes out of use, people come in and reuse the marble furnishings. Here we've got 2 marble column drums, and then one of the pillars, posts that's connected with the marble chancel panels in the eastern part of the church. They've been removed, reused as foundation courses for mud brick walls built on top. When you've got a end to the church, immediately what happens, people come in, they remove, once again, a large part of the mosaic floor, and then install the large architectural pieces as the foundation courses for their later occupation. And there's a continued occupation of the building, which seems to stay structurally intact for some centuries before the roof collapses. You've got a very well-built south wall of the church here. Well, that was the last of the church buildings I was going to speak about. And I'll just say a few remarks about general summary. What do I learn from examining each of these 1,000 buildings to what's happening? Now, it looks to me that there's really very little evidence for any of the churches in modern day Jordan continuing beyond the 9th century. When the Crusaders arrive in 1099, there's some historical references to a remnant Christian population, but the number of places that are mentioned in Crusader documents is a handful, and there's precious little archaeological evidence for any Christians left in modern day Jordan, which is incorporated southern Jordan into part of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. So I think even before the Crusaders arrived in what is modern day Jordan, the Christians had long since ceased to be the majority of the population. Now, in what is modern day Israel, west of the Jordan River, I have the impression that the Christians stay the majority or a large portion of the population even through the Crusades. It's maybe half and half when the Crusaders show up. It's half Christian, half Muslim, within the Jewish population up in the Galilee and the Golan Heights. Now, that's one part of what's going on with the Christians. I have in mind giving a second talk, and this is a preview. What do you notice about that mosaic floor? I hope you see there's something weird about it. This is a mosaic floor from Jordan that was dedicated in the year 719, 720. So this is not quite 100 years after the Muslim conquest.
Horse feet?
Well, yes, you've got the hind part, the hind legs and hooves of an ox. Well, I mean, it's an ox. And then the tail of an ox, the front legs, hooves of an ox, and part of the hump on the back. Okay, so the question is, why did the mosaicists want to include random body parts of an ox in their mosaic floor? Well, if you want to know, come for part 2 when that gets scheduled. Okay, so thank you for
So in the beginning of your talk, you said that the question was what percentage of the population was still Christians and what were
yes.
not. But why is that the question? Why is that an important question when the Crusaders came?
Well, that happens to be the question I particularly choose to be interested in. You might not really care so much, but what is the objective of the Crusaders? Why are they coming? They're coming to liberate the Holy Land from the infidel Muslims. But if the majority of the population are Muslim, who are they being liberated from when the Crusaders arrived? I mean, if the majority population are Muslims, the Muslims are not being liberated from anything by the Crusader presence. They're, well, so is it still a Christian majority country, or is it already a Muslim majority country? Well, that's going to be the question I am personally interested in. Interested in. Thank you.
Wait for the microphone. Hold on, the microphone's going back there.
Right. I think the idea of the Crusaders was the idea of Jerusalem, and not about the people. It was about the land of Jerusalem, their idea, as opposed to the people.
Yeah. Well, yes. Well, there certainly are still plenty of local Christians around who would be Orthodox mostly, and when the Crusaders arrive, they slaughter everybody. Especially, well, the Jews and Muslims get massacred repeatedly by the Crusaders, but the Crusaders do recognize the Orthodox Christian population and have better relations with them than they do when they initially conquered the area. They're slaughtering everybody who's not a Christian. Well, yeah, so the goal is to liberate Jerusalem from the hands of the infidel Muslims.
Robert,
Yes.
one of the things that I learned when I was studying this in this period was that the Muslims did conquer the churches, or took the churches and turned them into mosques.
But they don't.
Because they were already sacred places. Maybe that's based on the fact that in Jerusalem you have the mosque built on top of the Solomon's Temple, but that was a good example of that. And I think maybe what I learned was that this was the practice, since the ground was already sanctified, and it was also a symbol of conquering. We have conquered you, therefore we build our church on top of your church. This is what I was learned, but obviously that's not true, or it's been found to be not true.
Okay, well, there are a couple of examples of shared Christian-Muslim religious interest in some specific sites. And you have then the major case of the Temple Mount that the Muslims take over and build as the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. Now, there's one, okay, I was debating whether to put this in my slide presentation, but I had too many other things to talk about and glad I left it out. But anyway, there's one prime example of a shared Christian-Muslim pilgrimage site. It's the place halfway between Jerusalem and Bethlehem, where in the Christian tradition, the Virgin Mary, with Joseph on the way to Bethlehem, paused so that she can rest. And she sits under a tree and rests, and then they go on to Bethlehem. Now, there's a verse in the Quran referring to this incident where the Virgin Mary is exhausted and so needs to pause and rest. And God causes the branch of a date palm tree to bend over so that the Virgin Mary can pluck a date and eat it and refresh herself. So now the Christians build a pilgrimage church at the spot that they assign to this tradition. And the Muslims, because there's this verse in the Quran about that incident, are also interested in it. And in the early Islamic period, seemingly the 8th century, there's evidence that a mihrab niche is inserted into the south wall of that Christian church, with a very real possibility that there is a shared Muslim-Christian continued use of that church. Seemingly, it might well be the case that the Muslims did not expel the Christians who were there, but they're both Christians and Muslims sharing that sacred space. Another case is the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, where in the 9th century, 10th century, Muslims take over the south aisle of the church, with the rest of the church seemingly still continuing in the hands of the Christians. And then in the 10th century, the Muslims choose to leave, and they shift the tradition of Mary and Jesus and his birth and Jesus' cradle, they shift to Jerusalem. So that's another case where there seems to be a shared Christian-Muslim use of a sacred space.
I think we're out of time.
Very interesting, Robert. Thank you. I don't know how you figure all that stuff out, but that's why you're the archaeologist and I'm not.
And you're the coroner.
Deputy.
Yeah.